The Pete Hegseth nomination got through, since we've spoken last. The other controversial nominations are coming up. Tulsi Gabbard, I'm seeing and reading that there may be some pushback on Tulsi. Also, RFK Jr. may face some headwinds, but they're doing some things tactically, it seems, to try to drag those nominees over the finish line.
Well, I think the important thing to note is that, for one thing, they started, day one of the Trump administration last Monday. I don't know if we'll ever see this again. A 99-0 confirmation for Senator Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. So that was a big win, and has proven even the last week to be important when you're dealing with countries like Colombia. We may not have time to get into that, but there's that. Hegseth got across. He got across just barely. I mean, it took the vice president's vote. J.D. Vance came to the Senate chambers to break a 50-50 tie that got Hegseth in after three senators, including notably Mitch McConnell, said no. But this is a big week, this one coming up, because you're going to have RFK hearings. He's got to appear, by the way, before two committees. You're going to have Tulsi Gabbard, which is the one everybody says is probably the most dicey. And then Patel, who's going to be, the one that's been nominated now for Department of Justice. So this is going to be a big, intense week in the confirmation process on the Hill.
It's interesting to me that Hegseth could make it through, as you say, just squeak by. By the way, in modern history of DOD heads, I don't think there's ever been one that close. I mean, they're always,
that's right.
There might be 10 senators laying out, or 8 or 5 or even fewer. But, the fact that there was so much resistance to this guy tells you something. I don't know that it matters in the end, but I mean, history is, it stands aside in history is that. But it's interesting that he then, having squeaked by, gets in, and yet there is all of this talk about these others. Can you just put some specifics on Tulsi Gabbard, for example?
Yeah, well, let's go down the list real quick and say that RFK reportedly is looking in pretty good shape. He has met with a lot of Democratic senators as well as Republicans, and apparently assuaged a lot of concerns. There will certainly be some hard questions about everything from vaccinations on down the list. But word right now that RFK looks like he's likely to be confirmed. Patel for Department of Justice, likewise. There's going to be some hard questioning, but the feeling is right now that probably Republicans on the Hill are saying he's probably getting through. Tulsi Gabbard is going to be a tougher slog. It's interesting because she, of course, already served in the House as a Democrat, right? So you would think, I mean, just on the surface, say, wait a minute, what gives her? Okay, shouldn't she have an easier go than the others? I think, frankly, part of the politics that's making it tough for Gabbard is the switch from Democrat to Republican, right? I mean, that is in the modern era, and I'm going to say real modern, like the last 10 years, that's a big no-no, right? You sort of choose sides, take out your sword, and that's it. So I personally think behind the scenes, that's making it tougher for her. Democrats saying, listen, we don't like the fact that you're on Team Trump now at all. And so there's some positions she's taken in the past that have people, raising concerns. But let's not forget, let's say 5 years ago, she was something of a media darling. It's hard to remember that, but she was seen as, somebody who was kind of a truth teller, so to speak, out there in the public arena. But right now, she's going to be in her big-time microscope come her confirmation hearing this week.
She speaks very well in front of a microphone. She's been a very effective spokesperson for her position. She ran well, actually, when she was primarying in the general election on the Democratic side, as you point out. So she does come across well, and she's now had many more at bats as a Fox. I think she has a show, or she's a regular analyst there. So she's an interesting story. So all of those things are sort of superficial. She comes across well, she speaks well on camera, et cetera. When you actually get into her knowledge of the this world of intelligence that she's going to be in charge of, she gets pretty thin pretty fast, doesn't she, Gary?
Yeah, I actually was kind of surprised that she got that nod from Trump. I'm not exactly sure the backstory about that, why that versus other positions. I expected, and I think most did, she'd be offered something in the Trump administration. interestingly, the Director of National Intelligence is not a household name or word, right? I mean, it's really kind of a behind the scenes position. A lot of work with the National Security Council in the White House, a lot of work with intelligence agencies like the CIA and others, but it's not really an upfront position. So I'm not exactly sure why that was the one put out there for Gabbard, but she's going to have some, as Ricky Ricardo used to say, some splaining to do. And, I hate to say this, but it seems like in the modern era, Mark, you know how this goes. There needs to be a sacrificial lamb in the confirmation process. It just seems like that's the way it goes. I mean, was Gates enough? He withdrew his name, of course, before even being put before a committee. So I don't know whether that's going to satisfy, partisans who it just seems like in our day, there's got to be a pound of flesh to pay in this confirmation process these days. There's just no getting around that. Is Tulsi Gabbard going to be that person? I think it's yet to be seen.
Brett says problem with Tulsi isn't that she switched sides; it's that she promotes pro-Russian disinformation and conspiracy theories. Yeah, well, she's certainly in the Assad thing, and yeah. Now, I want to get you to the Friday night massacre of the inspectors general. I'll try to just take this chronologically. We'll start on Friday night when Trump fired at least 12 inspectors general, right? And then I'll get to the chronology that brought him to really a war of words and threats with the nation of Colombia. We'll get to that in a second. But apparently I didn't know this, Gary, but apparently when you fire inspectors general, you need to give Congress 30 days advance notice of this, right? And
that's exactly right. And that's why, by the way, Lindsey Graham over the weekend said, look, he really should have given us a 30 days advance notice.
So when Lindsey Graham says that, who is, the golfing pal with Trump, it means that they're at least flustered by it. I don't know that in the end it'll matter, though. He's going to get rid of these inspectors general.
Yeah, even if he gives a 30-day notice, there's really nothing Congress can do. I mean, they can squawk about it, right? But the president's going to eventually get that to happen. Typically what happens, of course, is a request is made when a president comes in for many positions. And it's not uncommon for inspectors general to get that same form letter, right? Hey, new administration, we'd like you to tender your resignation. We have others in mind, right? That's not uncommon in a variety of positions. But, unfortunately, you used the term at the beginning. Unfortunately, this came across, as a Friday night massacre when you released 12 of them without notice. I'm not exactly sure why Trump felt the need to skirt Congress in this thing. I mean, it would have been simple enough for his chief of staff to put out the word. Here's the list. It's 30 days notice. In 30 days, they're gone.
Right. And from a bottom line standpoint, nothing changes. I mean, and so again, just to reiterate something that everyone is probably aware of, but these are the watchdogs, so they're going to be gone. The Inspector General will be gone from the Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Defense, Education, Housing and Urban Development. All of the different agencies will be Interior, Labor, Transportation, Veterans Affairs. No longer will they have Inspectors General there. The EPA and the SBA, also nothing. So this is a substantial decision he's made. There's no political price to pay for this, though. This feels to me like something that'll evaporate. People may not even remember it from Friday night. But the fact that it happened on Friday night, Gary, isn't nothing, right?
Yeah, no, it's obvious it was done in the dead of the night to start the weekend. You know how this goes on news cycles, Mark. I mean, it was intended to be buried in everything else. And in fact, it already has been, to your point, in a couple of weeks, especially in a few days when we get these big major cabinet nomination hearings. I think it will be forgotten in a sense, but I think it was a mistake politically for Trump to do it. You don't want to be ruffling feathers among senators in particular that you need to confirm your nominees. They're not, some at least aren't happy about it. Others are more resigned, kind of what you said, what was going to happen anyway. But I just think it was a political misstep, too rash, too brash. But, it is what it is now. It's not going to be retreated on. The other thing to note is that, you typically don't release them en masse like that. That was the other thing that looked a little, heavy-handed. So, I think Trump and his team, some on his team are going to be more aware of this. You got to be careful. You only want to, throw so many darts at the board to kind of miss the board completely before your own team starts saying, hey, wait a minute, So will he get away with this? Yeah. Is there a big price to be paid politically? No. Are people taking note of it and saying, don't do this every day? Yes.
Inspectors General are charged with rooting out government waste, fraud, and abuse and preventing misconduct, said Senator Elizabeth Warren. President Trump is dismantling checks on his power and paving the way for widespread corruption. If you put that to the side, let me just ask you about something that Project 2025 strategized around, and that is the draining of money to all of these various government agencies that they kind of consider the administrative state, the deep state. We're going to choke them off by essentially eliminating their funding. Could this have been a brick in that wall?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting to see who he appoints as new inspectors general and how closely, if at all, is there any communication with the Doge team? You know what I mean? Which sort of has its own, I don't know, you could call it informal inspector general role, right? I mean, it's supposed to be looking at all the agencies, not only their fiscal matters, but their actual, tasks and evaluating those, which is typically an inspector general role, right? And I think the other part about it is, how closely is Congress going to be drilling down into some of these agencies? Sometimes it's been kind of hands off until some big problem erupts. But I think right now, all the cards are on the table. I mean, certainly Doge is part of that, but I think there's a lot of Republican members of Congress who themselves have said, look, it's not going to be business as usual. Even these agencies that are run by Trump heads, we're going to be looking with a much closer microscope at what you're doing, what it's costing, and what the actual benefits are.
It's interesting, too. Doge will be reconstituted, it would seem. They may even move Elon into the White House and all of these. I'm going to get into that this week and in other conversations, but it's still what you're talking about, which is that Musk is very much in the president's ear about those areas of government that require funding, should get funding, and those that are wasteful. So take me to this Colombian thing. Gustavo Petro, a president's name that I didn't even know before this, I will confess. He is the president of Colombia, and he refused the American deportees that were sent there by military aircraft. Now, the initial back and forth brought Trump to, great, if you don't let us land there and deport these illegals, we will impose on you 25% tariffs. And that seemed to immediately produce a kind of change in Petro's general disposition. Ultimately, he did allow the planes to land. Can you speak to this situation, how it might play out also elsewhere?
Yeah, well, I think there's really two or three big parts of this that are important to note. One is, when they are your nationals, if you don't want planes from the U.S. coming to land and they, have entered another nation's borders, U.S. or anybody else's, you better come up with some kind of a plan to have them come back, right? I don't know how you choose to do it. Send your own airlines out there. There's even talk about him now sending his presidential plane to go pick these folks up. But you can't just say no if they're your own national citizens. They crossed the border into any other country illegally, and then to say, well, we're not taking them back, because they weren't. The president of Colombia said they weren't treated respectfully, et cetera. Well, you better have a plan B. That's sort of number one. Secondly, you got to be careful, that your dog is big enough if you're going to put him in a fight, because immediately when Trump announced the 25% tariff, the Colombian president within an hour said, okay, well, you know what? We're giving you a 25% tariff on U.S. goods and services, to which, a lot of Americans, and political leaders said, oh, okay, well, we might have to pay more for X, Y, Z. But the reality, if you just look at the trade balance between the two nations, Colombia far more dependent. The U.S. is Colombia's biggest trading partner, and you got to be careful, right? You make a threat like that, which, by the way, he backed off on just hours later, said, okay, we'll let him in. I think his own people said, hey, wait a minute, that may not be the best plan. So I think that's the other thing, is that it does appear that the other side, that is the Colombian side of the negotiations or equation, sort of realized their hand wasn't as strong to play as they thought it might have been.
Yeah, it appears exactly as you suggested that, they folded like a pup tent right away. And I mean, I do think it's sort of one of those things where you feel bullied. And when you're bullied, you push back, perhaps reflexively, when the reality is, as you suggested, you may not be in a position to push back. But I think of the Mexican president. She, with the Gulf of America stuff, and I mean, she did kind of make fun of it and push back, and Trump hasn't really said much about her since.
Well, I think if you want to compare those, I think the interesting part of it is just what you got into a little bit, Mark, which is the details. So what was her response to the Gulf of America thing? She got in front of a big giant map and said, well, as a matter of fact, we're going to start calling you all, hey, Northern Mexico, at least the southern border states, right? They used to be controlled by Mexico, of course, in the past. Now, see, the thing about it is that was sort of a rhetorician's, or a public spokesperson's kind of approach to it. Get in front of a map, say, well, we're going to say, that's very different than saying you're going to slap 25% tariffs on your northern neighbor, right? And I think that's, if there's a lesson to come out of this, it's like, okay, you can have pushback, and it's clear the Mexican government is not going to recognize, the Gulf of America. They've made that clear. I don't expect them to do it, right? In fact, the AP, interestingly, said, okay, we're not going to recognize that either because it's in international waters, so to speak. So good luck with that. But it's a very different thing than taking a hard-line policy prescriptive like Colombia did with your biggest trading partner. Does that make sense? You got to, in other words, the international relations folks would say calibrating your response is very important.
Well, I think calibrating your response, and also what you said, which is you have to know, how big your dog is or whatever. You have to know that there's a little more heft, I think, in the case of Mexico than there is in the case of Colombia. So I think both those things are true. In the next last minute, I just wanted to ask you something else that happened. Again, it was a fire hose of stuff happening as Trump took office. He rolls back the prohibitions on executive branch employees accepting major gifts from lobbyists and ditching bans on lobbyists seeking executive branch jobs or vice versa. He's rolled that back for at least 2 years. It's a strange thing given the fact that he again, didn't mention Drain the Swamp this time. Drain the Swamp was the 2016 run, but these ethics rules are being aggressively rolled back. And of course, we know that he has launched a cryptocurrency token, that Melania has one, that there are a number of different revenue streams, to be polite. I would call them grifts, that are going on concurrent with this administration that he benefits from. So he's really like an ongoing master of many different revenue streams, all of which I'd suggest would fly in the face of existing ethics were we enforcing them. But now we don't have to worry about enforcing them because he does seem to be rolling them back. Go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to say, and let's add to that the House Republicans meeting at the Trump Doral Golf Course today for 3 days, right? I mean, we went through that before, remember, in Trump version 1, when people, are there going to be meetings held at his Washington, D.C. hotel, and what's the financial implications? It seems like that's kind of water under the bridge. What I want to say quickly about that, and I do feel like I need to say 30 seconds about Trump and Newsom on the tarmac on Friday, Mark. But let's just quickly on this one. I think that the rubber's going to meet the road here in the next 6 to 12 months. Trump's got to be careful, and I'm sure his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, knows this. You don't want what are relatively minor things. In other words, did some lower person in the administration get tickets to a football game? You don't want that to overshadow the big stuff. And that's the risk with some of this ethics stuff. You have to be careful about it. Even what seems minor on the surface to start with can become, as you know, a big story. And that's what I'm sure people inside his team in the White House are saying, Mr. President, let's just be aware of what this could bring in terms of attention that we don't want in a year or two. So that's yet to be sorted out. I do want to quickly say that
give us a moment. Go ahead.
Trump and Newsom real quickly surprised a lot of people when, I mean, look at that. You know, it looked like, I don't know, bros getting together, as we say in the modern terminology, right? And there was handshaking, there was back slapping, there was smiling, conversing. It was completely the opposite of what everybody expected. There's going to be a lot of eyeballs watching this relationship very carefully in the next couple weeks and months as the LA situation unfolds. But I will tell you this, either one or both of them was a master at saying, this ain't going to benefit us. Let's just cool it, at least for today, right? Because compared to the rest of the fireworks, you know, that happened that day in terms of Trump and Bass going at each other and all, these guys look like they were best of friends.
No, it's very, very true. And it's smart politics, of course. I also wonder, and maybe you have a thought on this, when Trump gets back to the bubble where essentially the echo chamber of hate, I'm wondering to what extent there will be a renewal of these various demands of changes in California, and not even changes in California. It's not even things related to fire policy or water policy in California. They want immigration policy in California attached to any kind of funds that would come for relief.
Yeah, well, at least what Trump mentioned specifically last week was a voter ID, right? Wanted voter ID in California, which of course has nothing to do with the fire deal. And this, of course, is what we're going to be ferreting out in the first few weeks and months of the Trump administration. How much of this kind of stuff is just throw that bowl of spaghetti against the wall, see what sticks, get some attention for it, and how much of it is actually going to be implemented? In other words, are there going to be real, quote unquote, new conditions tied to California aid? You sure didn't hear that when he was on the ground last Friday. So that chapter yet to be written. We'll be following it closely for sure.
Gary, so appreciate you. Thank you for making time for us every Monday. It really was a pleasure, and I look forward to next week as well. It's I'll tell you honestly, it all comes at us so fast. Sometimes I forget, like the agenda must change almost on an hourly basis, so I appreciate you keeping us so posted. Thank you. Gary Dietrich, everybody. Bye, Gary. Gary's segment is sponsored by Bill Campbell at RE/MAX Gold. If you're relocating to or from Northern California, we have a lot of great Northern California listeners and viewers. If you need a highly respected real estate professional, let me tell you, Bill Campbell is a great place to start, and he's a great place to finish right there. Bill Campbell at RE/MAX Gold. Call or text Bill 530-448-7474, 530-448-7474. Again, Bill Campbell, RE/MAX Gold.
The Mark Thompson Show.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.